I went to the track on Mother's Day. I had my kids take me.
Look,
They
whoa,
were little.
Liz,
They didn't
I
drive.
love that. What a Mother's Day. Holy cow. And I'm also a bit of a degenerate, so I'm looking at the gambling side of this thing too. Interesting numbers there.
Frustrations of not providing a viable car to his very talented drivers.
I would rather watch Carlos Sainz covered in champagne and wearing a Rolex than like some guy in Indy pour milk on his face.
We can finally say it. It's race week. We're giving you a doubleheader this week with 2 episodes of Unlapped hitting your feeds. Today, I'm luckily joined by ESPN's Liz Loza and Dalen Cuff, who have been catching up on Drive to Survive and getting hyped, as always, with the first week of the F1 season. Remember, if you're watching on YouTube, like this video, leave us a comment, and don't forget to subscribe to ESPN for more F1 content. And if you're listening, hit us with a 5-star review wherever you get your podcast. First time to the show, Liz Loza, how are you?
I am great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very, very excited to jump in.
Oh, we're so glad to have you. Thanks for stepping in. The guys are fast at work in Bahrain, so we'll touch base with them later in the week. Dalen, it's good to see your face.
Hi, Katie. It's great to see your face. Liz, great to meet you. Looking forward to working with you. Let's just say, as we just said off air, I'm a little frazzled, but I'm ready to go. We live in a tundra, Katie. You don't live up here. Liz, Liz, are you in the West Coast? You're in somewhere nice?
In Los Angeles, yeah.
Okay, well, it snowed there this week, I heard too. But anyway, it's a bit of a nightmare here in the Northeast. And flying back from Florida, it's just really depressing to come in with that kind of weather. But to have this conversation, I'm pretty pumped about this, though. So we're good.
Yeah, you get a little bit of an escape. How about that? To talk a little bit F1. So let's do it, shall we?
Yeah, let's do it.
How have the two of you been coping with the off season? Did you enjoy the time off, or are you just like buzzing to get back, Liz?
I mean, you said buzzing. I've been spending the time with a lot of skinny espressos. I've been taking the chocolate out of my croissants, regularly listening to Unlapped, of course, checking everybody's Instagrams and bemoaning a season without Danny Ricciardo. But I think there might be an asterisk to that.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting just because, like, Katie, you know this, and I'll tell our audience too. Like, I'm the typical American in terms of new to the sports. You know, been a fan for you. This is my first off season from it, so there is a jonesing and there's an excitement. The fact you said race week, like it hadn't hit me yet. Like, here we go. And I'm also a bit of a degenerate, so I'm looking at the gambling side of this thing too. Interesting numbers there have been tossed out. Just from testing, changed a lot of stuff, but. Yeah, it's been cool to kind of to see the crazy offseason that F1 has and kind of experience that relative to the other sports I've been a fan of or cover.
Do you want to tell us how exactly you got involved in the sport? What led you down this F1 path?
Wow.
Be honest.
Look at leading the witness here. You're not the first person to tell me, but Katie was the straw that broke the camel's back last year at the Final Four in New Orleans. She's like, dude, you've got to watch Drive to Survive. And I'm like, okay, you're like the 25th person to tell me that. But clearly the most intelligent person that I would listen to so acutely. And also New Orleans was a petri dish. I got COVID and then I came back. I got COVID down there. When I came back, I had time and nowhere to go. Couldn't see my daughter. So all of a sudden I racked out all 4 seasons in about 5 days, and became a Max Verstappen fan along the way.
Oh no, Dalen,
I know, Liz, I heard
no.
Well, I didn't. Here's the thing. I shouldn't tell. I mean, yes, our audience, yes, I am the new guy to the mix here. As I'm watching, I started watching season 1 before I saw a race. It was in between. I guess it was right after Australia. So there's a break. I guess it must have been 2 weeks or week between races. So I started watching the show then. And after season 1, I'm like, this guy Max, bit of a prick, but I like him. I like him a lot. And then I did a research. And I'm like, oh, he's the reigning world champ. I'm joining the evil empire. But I was already in, and there we go.
Yeah. Do you like Rocky IV as well? The opening scene.
I've said that to KG before. What are you cheering for the Soviets? You're cheering for Drago? Yes. Liz, you kind of hit me. I feel a little. I love it. I do love him. I love the characters they play. I love Horner is this evil dude too. He has this evil thing to him within Drive to Survive. Villain, not evil. So yeah, it's antithetical to a lot of my other sports supporters. But I'm on board with Red Bull and I'm on board with Max.
Well, when we were sitting courtside at the Final Four, going back to that, we were having a conversation, and I know your love for soccer.
Yep.
And so I said, if you like the world sport of soccer, football, why don't you like the world sport of F1? I mean, it's unbelievably popular. It's so engaging. It's unlike any sport that we cover on a daily basis. I really think you'll enjoy following the sport, getting involved in it, a nice, easy way in is clearly to watch Drive to Survive, just to learn about it and learn about the characters that are on the grid. What did you make, Dalen, real quick, before we get to how Liz got involved in the sport? What did you make of the sport as you were introduced to it? What differentiated it from others?
I think you hit one thing there, is this like intellectual curiosity, and the fact that I do love soccer and have been a soccer fan and Arsenal fan for over 20 years, basically. There is this element of, okay, why doesn't America get this? What am I missing?
Not the first time or the last time people will ask that question.
Definitely not the last. But for me, I was like, what don't I want to kind of be in the know, for lack of a better term, or understand this world. And I do think Drive to Survive is like this ultimate foray into it, because it gives you the drama piece when you're still trying to understand the sport. You're not really, you're picking up the comments about tire strategy, and when you're, double stacking in the pits or whatever, you're picking up little pieces. And this is before I've seen a race, but it's getting you involved in the storylines. It's getting you encroached in that. And one thing you did pick up here that came through very clear again in this series, scarcity has value. And there's a scarcity of races, which I'm not sure the FIA continues to, or F1 continues to understand as they expand more and more. But there's a scarcity of seats, a scarcity of teams, and that creates like a value and an interest and an urgency in like everything that happens. Not to mention the worlds you're going to, the different continents, beautiful people, sexy cars, fun time. It just, the whole sport kind of opened up like a different thing to me. And I do think it's covered very differently. And being a global sport, you see it too. Different countries cover it different ways. We have drivers from that country. That angle that comes through sometimes, and the coverage is interesting, and the conversation more broadly versus that country. There's just a lot of different layers you start to pull back. But it was a awesome experience to get involved, and now I'm fully hooked. And I feel like Katie has spread the gospel to quite a few of us that we know, and now we have a text chain with like 10 people we work with that are all within the last 12 months have become really into F1.
Yeah, and I'm glad you entered into this world, because it is so unbelievably fascinating. Liz, what enticed you to get involved in the sport?
Well, like Dalen and a lot of people, Drive to Survive was the gateway for me, was the onboarding content that got me involved. But I will say I grew up in the Midwest, so racing was not abnormal. I was raised by a single mom, and my mom did, I will say at this point, unfortunately, date a guy who was obsessed with his Pantera di Tommaso, and it made for some interesting weekends. Racing around, going to like the track. And yet my father was South American. And so there was a first generation American. So there's a global aspiration. I think like those things converged. And when so many people became interested was over the pandemic, and you're locked down, and yet you're watching these race drivers and these whole, pit crews travel to different parts of the world, and you're just stuck in your house, your apartment. They're spraying each other with rose water or champagne, depending on the location. And you're just like happy that you got a can of garbanzo beans at the grocery store that day. Like those times I think allowed this wonderful, global appeal, especially because there was such, to use a word that you just did, Dalen, like an antithetical feeling to that at the time. And it was sexy. And it was, I'm just going to say it, like, I would rather watch Carlos Sainz covered in champagne and wearing a Rolex than like some guy in Indy pour milk on his face.
Yeah, that's very fair. And you paint a very drastic, different picture there. I think that there's just so many layers to it, right? You bring up the logistical nightmare that is the travel, and how these crews do what they do as often as they do it. That was eye-opening to me when I was on the ground in Miami for the inaugural Miami Grand Prix last year, seeing just how big, what a behemoth of a sport this is in terms of the heavy lifting that these guys, these groups, these women, they do on a weekly basis was fascinating. Then you bring in just the cultural infusion that is the paddock, right? All these different cultures, all these different countries represented. That I think certainly makes it unique. Something that you see similarly in the world of soccer, Dalen. And then for me, having played a team sport, watching a team sport, and yet your teammate is your direct and biggest competitor, that was, I think, what kind of intoxicated me when I started learning and diving into this sport was there is nothing like it. Individual sports, team sports, as we know it here in the States, that dynamic doesn't exist anywhere else. And I truly have found that to be so incredibly fascinating.
I think that you're just dead on. I think that's really interesting too. I think you added to the machine piece of it. Like you have to have, this team has to build this machine that no matter how talented you are, if that part is not done by the team well and everybody executes their piece.
Look at Mercedes last year.
Yeah, you not only can't win, you can't compete like in the level that you may want to compete or have historically competed. There's all these different factors going into the fact that, you know, a relatively small dude is sitting in a rocket ship and riding around a course.
Also remind you, and as a wagering enthusiast, the analogy between the racetrack meaning horse racing and this, like, these are slight gentlemen akin to jockeys, and they're trying to get the best advantage out of their ride. And instead of a live animal that is bred to be a certain way, there are engineers who are putting way more brain power than I have into creating this aerodynamic rocket ship. And I think that analogy, I mean, of course, I went to the track on Mother's Day. I had my kids take me. They're little.
Liz,
they didn't drive.
I love that. What a Mother's Day! Holy cow!
They're like, they were 7 and 4, but we went to the racetrack because it's fun, right? And so I can understand where the wagering piece comes into this too. And with just 10 teams currently, and just 20 drivers, it's also easy to fall in love with these characters. It's not, I cover the NFL, right? It's not like you have 32 teams and all of these players, 50 some players that you have to learn about. Like, you can hear the stories of players, of race drivers and pit crew members that aren't just the stars, and find a way to emotionally connect to the different teams. And again, I think the global thing, just to hit on what Katie said or reiterate it, like, we have Felipe Drogovic, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, the reserve driver. Thank you, for Aston Martin. I mean, I hear that guy's name and I'm like, he's from where? Really? This like Austrian, I believe he's representing Brazil. And like, what an incredible amalgamation of cultures that I think in many ways is representative of the United States.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And I think it's really interesting that you bring up jockeys. That was my first comparison when I went to Miami. My family members, people were, what's it like? What were the drivers like? What was Charles Leclerc like when you interview, things like that. And I said, and I don't think like I'm an abnormally huge individual. I mean, I played college volleyball, but I still think I'm a little undersized. And maybe Dalen, I told you, they're small guys, and I likened them to jockeys because obviously the lighter, the better. And now you've got some, Alex Albon is obviously very tall, George Russell, tall, string bean kind of guy, but small is better because of what they're trying to do with the machine. And I found that fascinating as well. So that's a very good, I think, comparison that you make, Liz. I want to dive in because last week with Nate and Lawrence, we discussed episodes 1 through 5 of Drive to Survive. We thought it would be easy because there's so much obviously to cover, to break it down. So want to just get your all's initial reactions. I know that you guys have both watched the show religiously. I believe you both finished the show, but just overall, what was your biggest takeaway, Liz?
Well, I think first of all, kudos to Netflix for being able to so accurately pinpoint the characters that are going to pop on screen, to discover the Gunther and ride that storyline, to follow the Danny Ricciardos. I will say that I had 2 favorite episodes. The first was episode 4, Like Father, Like Son, which deals with the head case that was Mick Schumacher, and the layers to that. And I felt, there were so many cringe moments, but I felt for that kid. I was a figure skater growing up, and I know the minute you get into your head, your program is screwed. And the other times where you've just got nothing going on up there and you're trusting your body, it goes much better. So I thought that was like a really fascinating narrative to tell from a team that frankly doesn't get a lot of pub because they're always 10th. And so I also, I shouldn't say they're not Williams, but they're back there. And then I also liked Alpha Male because I liked how different Yuki Tsunoda is. And I think actually Lawrence and Nate mentioned that the last episode, how different he is from the rest of the pack. His hatred for working out validated so much of me avoiding leg day. I loved that he was like, I hate working out. I love that he was really unafraid of being himself, and just kind of being a maniac and barking back at the primary when they've asked him to do something mid-race. Like, I thought that was really interesting. So I think that Netflix does a brilliant job of finding those stories and finding an emotional touch point for viewers. I wish, however, and this is where it gets sticky, like that which onboarded me onto the sport is now falling short of what I want, because my legit fandom and knowledge of the sport has sort of outpaced what the producers are willing to provide in terms of a docuseries. You've mentioned accurately, Katie, in previous episodes, how they seem to recycle the same race. Like, I get what happened at Silverstone. I got it. I've seen it 14 times. And I understand that there are different, the mid-pack teams have different narratives and storylines for every race, but I've seen Zhao fly into the barriers 14 times now. And yet he had like a 15-second interview. So I think I would like to see at this point, and again, it's because I think I've just allowed myself to become more knowledgeable of and saturated in F1, a little more messiness, a little more fly on the wall, actual documentary-ness instead of a bunch of winks.
That's an interesting point, because I think it's smart that you're saying. I think you're right. You're right. I do think it's same element. They have a huge audience they're catering to that actually aren't us, that aren't the converted fans, that are still people that are watching the show, and maybe that's why they're not willing to dive more into some of it. Like the strategy blunders, they showed the Ferrari strategy blunders. They talked about it. Matteo talked about it, but they didn't go into like a little, what the hell were you thinking? I would love to ask some more follow-up questions. Yes, Katie?
We didn't get the finger wagging conversation either. That was one of my, biggest gripes. But just to point out, Ferrari is a more hands-on, controlling PR team.
Yep.
The teams do get a say in what is shown, whereas Haas, I think why Haas has become such a fan favorite on this show is they're very flippant with, hey, this is who we are, and you know what, take it or leave it. And we're going to show you exactly, the trials and tribulations of what we're going through. And I think that's what's endeared Haas and especially Gunther to a lot of fans.
Real question. I don't know, we can't curse in the podcast, but effing hell.
Yes, you can.
His catchphrase, fucking hell. What do you think the percentage of his actual words are said? You think it's like 20% of his actual words are that
I don't
phrase?
know.
Because it's high. I don't know. I might do the math.
He says it every other conversation. I think that's like instead of saying hello or hey, how are you or ciao, that's what he starts with.
I thought it was great. They used that one thing like, well, we can't use the language. He goes, what language did I use? And I thought I thought he dropped an F-bomb, but then he said hugged. But I'm like, I think our brains are just trained to assume that it was an F-bomb. But them discovering Gunther and riding him for the years has been impressive. I do think that he is still him, whereas why I don't think they're going to miss Daniel Ricciardo as much, as I feel like Ricciardo has become. Either you guys watch Seinfeld?
Oh yeah,
anybody watch Seinfeld? So then Seinfeld and Larry David left. It was last season or two. Like a lot of the characters became caricatures of themselves. Like Kramer was doing this intern thing, and he's doing he's going to work versus just being the random neighbor. He was becoming a character of himself. George similarly did the same. They kind of wrote George in a different way. It's almost like I feel like when I see Ricciardo now, it's like he's playing to that guy that was publicized at Netflix. I feel like his shtick, and he was not even. I only got through episode 6. I still have a couple to go, but I feel like he still is shown. I feel like he leans into it, or that's what they show about him is kind of the same stuff we expect, with the exception of, I do think when they went into after he lost his ride, lost his seat, you can see, and Liz, you mentioned this earlier, and we're all former athletes, and then we get the psychology of it is very interesting. As soon as that confidence is shaken, and you can see him saying some things that's a little bit of false bravado, but then opening to other people about how he was hurt. And you can see, as soon as that's in you, I don't know how you really sit in that car confidently. And Mick at times was asking, where's Kevin? Where's Kevin? He's not worried about where somebody else is, a different team. He's not worried about chasing somebody else down. He's just worrying about his direct competitor on his team, who's, again, to Katie's point, not supposed to be necessarily his direct competitor, but that's what's in his head as he's driving around. And then the race that he performed well in, you could hear his voice change through the race. You could hear the energy, you could hear the confidence, and you could almost feel him let go. But to have that dynamic be so apparent in a sport that's so like, that's scary. These are life and death situations.
Life and death,
you're sitting there questioning little things. I can't imagine the psychology. Like, if I missed the jump shot, nothing bad's going to happen. If you make the wrong move in that car, some really bad stuff can happen. The psychology of it's interesting. I thought that was the one time I would want more of that from Daniel Ricciardo. That's, I guess, my point. I feel like I would less of the caricature and more when you peel back the layers of anybody. I think it makes it interesting. But for him, I feel like if that's what they're going to have him be, then I'm not really going to miss going forward. That's how I look at it.
I love that. That's a pretty bold take, because I think the general narrative is like, oh no, there's no Danny. Who's the character now? Who's the lovable, nice guy? But I think you're right, because I did remember thinking, like, how many times are they going to ask him? What is he going to say? I'm thrilled that I got fired. He's not going to say that. Or he will say that and become further endearing to everybody. But I don't know. I mean, I think that in general, what we're all kind of hinting at is that the series is in this weird place where, obviously F1 wants it to continue because it has brought a massive amount of fandom and attention, particularly in America. Here's Vegas happening, right, to the sport. And yet they want to be protective of their players. They want to be protective of their brands. And so it's a fine line, because once it becomes, the NFL has had this issue with Hard Knocks. But the NFL is the NFL. It's the, biggest money-making sport in the world. And so once we get to this place where, I don't buy it anymore, then I don't think F1 is popular enough to kind of be that hidden. And you mentioned Haas, right? The stakes are different for them than Ferrari. So they can be more flipped, because any attention at this point is good attention. Yeah. I wish that Ferrari and Red Bull, frankly, in particular, would be a little bit, allow the team to be a little bit publicly messy. We all know about Max Verstappen's mom's tweet. So just own it.
Yeah. And it's interesting, because if you're only at 6, Dalen, your next episode is 7, and that's titled Hot Seat. And that goes into the drama that was Monaco for Red Bull. But they only really focus on Checo wrecking during qualies that obviously left, Max in 4th, I believe, to start that race. Now, it ended up working out for Red Bull, considering Ferrari kind of handed it to them and helped them out in that situation. But I was hoping that we would get to see a little bit more potentially between, the radio messages that we heard later on in the season between, Max Verstappen not appreciating team orders. And then obviously Checo being extremely upset about, you're clearly prioritizing him. We didn't get involved in that, which I hate, because that is part of the sport. Yeah. And I like seeing, I don't want to say dirty laundry, because that's not the right phrasing of it, but I like seeing the struggles of what these guys are going. It's an accurate representation. And you get later on in the series, you get episode 9, which is Over the Limit, with the budget cap, which there are rumors swirling that Red Bull is over. And I do find it so fascinating, because the team principals are very much stars as well, as we've mentioned, Gunther. But you go from episode 2, where we're talking and seeing Mercedes struggles with their car, Toto a little bit unhinged in the team principal meeting and grappling with frustrations of not providing a viable car to his very talented drivers, to team principals kind of taking Christian's side and not appreciating the way that Toto's kind of come into this meeting, to then everybody kind of turning on Christian Horner and Red Bull by the end of the season, because they've obviously breached a very, very important but new rule, and they want Red Bull to be held accountable. That to me was an interesting, I think, theme throughout this season that we got to see, of how team principals at all costs are trying to protect their drivers and their team, but how they use one another. They team up with one another depending on what the narrative is or the issue is at hand at a given point. And I thought that was fascinating, going from people being against Toto and his complaints to then people turning on and calling out. I mean, Zach Brown writes a very, very public letter about how Red Bull needed to be held accountable, and deeply so. And I just think that that was a fascinating layer of the season as well.
I don't think it's just the season. I think it's the sport. The politics are involved. You're describing essentially a political, juxtaposition of what one person's point is trying to make here versus another. How do you create allies? How do you create leverage? And we've seen that. That's also makes this a drama that we're unfamiliar with a lot of times. I mean, I know you may argue, Katie, that Max Verstappen is the world champion in 2021 based on a political decision, based on a decision by a body that's supposed to oversee the sport, putting their hand into the sport more than they would ever, or did something different than maybe was normally done for motivations that aren't purely about like equality of all athletes. It was about, creating a situation where you have 1v2 right there at the end of the race. Like they did that. I think there's a political piece here. And I do think some of these team principals, Christian particularly, I think understand the cameras are there and when they're there and how they say things and how they do different things. I thought it was written to Toto's like, I don't care that the cameras are here. And I believe that too. But he was making his point. The point was there's also an entitlement too with some of the, I think when you're trying to gain leverage, there's an entitlement there that I think exists with Mercedes and Red Bull in particular, that like Mercedes and Toto think you're expecting, we're entitled to be at top. We're not. I don't know how to handle this. I'm panicking. So I'm going to say we should do something different. Clearly Red Bull and Christian may have operated outside the letters of the law, and maybe they feel they could do that and get away with it and not get punished in a way that took away from their championship or hurt their drivers. And it seems that they did that. So like there's all these different elements that I don't know if they exist in other sports. And if they do, we don't see them because the pool is so small. I think the scarcity to me is like when there's such a small little world there that a whole world is watching, there's so much to like unpack.
Well, think about it. In the NFL, we might digest and break down a handshake gone poorly at the end of a game between two head coaches. Yeah. Right? Like these guys are actually like saying things to each other next to one another in their media sessions. Like they don't hold back. They pull back their cuffs and they throw pointed punches at one another in the media. That doesn't exist in other sports.
Well, it's the theater they set up too, Katie. They literally, I mean, when I first started watching the series, I'm like, wait a minute, they do pressers just sitting next to each other? Like just that alone, you are setting up, you were putting them on a stage to verbally argue. And then I don't know how that spills over. It spills over into other things. It's just like that's how the sport is set up, again, for as voyeurs to take it all in.
So then in the Over the Limit episode, though, Christian says, the higher you rise in this sport, the sharper the knives. It's a fantastic quote. But in that episode, then I wanted to see Toto interviewed. I wanted Toto to give his opinion because obviously that's the rivalry that they've that the series and probably in real life have created. And I mean, Zach Brown is an interesting character, but he's not Toto Wolff. And so even though it was Zach Brown who published the letter and there were moments I wanted to hear, like, give me like a 20-second soundbite from Toto Wolff just going after Horner in the like shadiest, but like most eloquent way possible. That would have felt so good.
Yeah, it really would have. Well, you need to catch up. So now that you're back home,
look at you point at me.
There's snow on the ground.
Katie, you do know it's still basketball season. We're going into March here. Down my head, my head's
get your priorities straight. All right.
I was watching this on the plane at 6 a.m. All right, I was getting them in when I could here, but I'm gonna get it done. Also, I'm enjoying it, but I'm like, I think I need to sleep. I'm gonna be on TV tonight till midnight. But I did.
Fair enough. But once get it done before the season starts, which is, by the way,
I'll be done. Yeah.
In a couple days. And I want to dive into the Bahrain Grand Prix. Get a couple predictions from you guys. See what you're most excited about. Testing was interesting to say the least. Obviously, Red Bull, I think, as we all know it, is continuing to dominate. They look like they've put together a great car that is fitting to both of their drivers. So I'll be curious to see how that moves forward. McLaren, as you mentioned, Liz, with their CEO, Zach Brown, might be starting on the back foot. They're bracing for a slower start because they missed some developmental targets, which is not what you want to hear as a driver, not what you want to hear as a team when you're about to embark upon a new season. We know that Felipe Drugovich is going to be filling in for Lance Stroll with Aston Martin to open up the season. So we've got a lot of storylines. Obviously, it's never-ending storylines in the sport, and I think that's part of why we love it as well. But what do you most
Katie, before you switch the race, I want to ask you guys something real quick about Mercedes, because Lewis, I'm coming out of testing. Lewis said we've got a mountain to climb. Do you think he said that because their car was, you can't read everything at the time. It's not like their car was bad and what didn't look like it did last year, or didn't have the same issues. They were able to fix some of the other cars that didn't look as bad. Or is that because he just thinks Red Bull they look that good? Or do you think that's posturing? Like, do you think that was like a genuine concern from Lewis?
I think so. I think it's a little bit of both. Obviously, they stuck with the zero pod design that they had a year ago. They left the season in much better shape than they did at the start, as we know. But I think that you can't scrap something that you've spent years trying to build and work towards. And so they're still going to try to tweak and capitalize on this design. Now, I think that that could still come with some issues. And I think that we saw that certainly a little bit in testing. And so I'll be curious to see if they're able to make adjustments quicker, but they still have a pretty wide gap between the Red Bull 19, Max Verstappen obviously being who he is at this point in the sport. So I do think it's going to be really fascinating to watch these first couple races to see just where are the margins, how far are off the, George Russell finished second at the last testing. Like that to me is promising. So maybe it is a tad bit of posturing. Liz, what did you make of it?
I mean, I think the fact that Mercedes, in fact, the technical director, Mike Elliott, came out and said that new bodywork was going to be coming and fans should expect an upgrade package, but it's not going to look like somebody else's car. It's going to look like an evolution of the W14, which admittedly struggled in the wind tunnel. So I think the fact that they know it's coming and are already designing these upgrades and just needing to implement them is different than being blindsided by the porpoising issues that arose at the top of last season. So they're braced for it. They are still, based on the testing, behind. I also think that the Aston Martin hype train is on full fleet coming out of testing. And I'm not sure I'm buying that they're the number 3 ranked car. I mean, their times out of testing last season were pretty impressive. And then they didn't really put it together on the grid. So I think that that's a little bit sus, if I'm being honest.
It's interesting, Liz, you say that because it's fair. But people are buying Fernando Alonso. If I'm talking to the betting side of things, his numbers in terms of people are investing in him to win the whole thing have gone up. Max's numbers have gone down a lot. We'll come to that in a second, I'm sure. But go ahead. That's interesting.
Keep going. Bold predictions. Liz has already started us off with the fact that she's not buying the hype of Aston Martin.
Well, here's the thing. I'll just say last week I was talking to Joe Fortenbaugh, who's one of our colleagues at ESPN and does a lot of the daily wager stuff, but we're going to talk a lot of this world in betting. And last week he said to me, he just texted me, he's like, is it weird that Max is only minus 120 to win it all? And just so folks know, that's betting $100 to win $80. And that's not a huge favorite. That's kind of like, if you're 1-to-1 plus 100, that's kind of like even money is good. And Barrett, that shocked me. I just assumed he would be minus 170, minus 175. Well, after testing, he went down to minus 165. From testing down, so now it's $45 for 100 to win 45. So your risk reward is much different. Thank you for Joe, because last week I just laid down a big bet on minus 120 because both of us were like, well, why not right now? Because we'll be able to see as things go on. If those odds change, you can make different plays. That's not a bold prediction. That's just the market surprised me. And I was surprised.
That's odds on the Drivers' Championship, though. I haven't seen anything on Bahrain yet.
No. Well, but there's nothing on Bahrain yet. There will be on the quality stuff. Will probably come out Thursday, our time, around then. So anyway, that surprised me. I do think maybe it's because I want this again. I think we may have a divided constructors driver champion. I think it may not be a clean, it may be a sweep. I know it doesn't happen often. It happened obviously in 21. It happened, I think, before maybe 19 or 09. But that, if I'm making a bold prediction, I would think that there could be, maybe Red Bull has more challenge than we think. I think Max may run away with it, but maybe the team may not be as tight. That would be my bold prediction.
I'd be interested to track the odds after Bahrain because, I think I am expecting that when the odds come out on Thursday, Max will be the favorite to win qualifying and probably win the whole race, right?
You could always bet the race. You could bet that race on Thursday too, I'm sure, but you may want to wait or maybe you don't. Right. If he doesn't qualify well, if his numbers change, you may want to bet after. I don't know.
But it's interesting because since 2017, the driver who has won the first race of the season has not won the Drivers' Championship. So if you are betting on Max to win the Drivers' Championship,
tell that to Charles Leclerc.
Exactly.
Right? I mean, and Bahrain is interesting because Alonso and Hamilton have each won the Bahrain Grand Prix 3 times. So that kind of varies my Aston Martin. I mean, that's then the Aston Martin Mercedes rivalry could be very well alive this weekend.
I am very curious to see how Ferrari competes obviously with Red Bull, but just how they fare, because after last season, the ups and the downs, and I like when we were in it and we were breaking down on Unlapped every single race at a certain point, like I just forget how much hype there was until going back and watching Drive to Survive after the first couple of races of like how we felt about Ferrari and those two drivers. And then just the plummet that was their hopes and Charles Leclerc's hopes. And so I'm really curious with Fred Vasseur in control as team principal, which I love. Mattia Binotto, Drive to Survive made me think, gosh, I'm sad that he's not going to be in the paddock anymore. And we're not going to get to hear from him because he was so composed. I always thought maybe, but that was, in thinking about it as I say this to you, maybe that was part of the problem. You can't just always say, we'll figure it out, we made a mistake. You have to get angry, you have to make changes, and you can't keep making the same mistake over and over again. I'm really curious to see how they come out of the gate with Fred Vasseur, and if we see a clean race, or do we immediately see, well, it's the same shit that we saw all last season, middle of the way through into the end. And so I'm hopeful that we see a cleaner start for Ferrari. Because I love when they're good. Like it's like some of the NFL teams, some of the NBA teams, like some of the college basketball teams, like Louisville, for instance. Louisville helps the sport when it's good, Dalen. Yep. Ferrari needs to be good. And having them a part of the conversation last year was so much fun while it lasted.
But I maybe I am, because my bold prediction is that I am buying that Vasseur is going to make a difference. I think part of was watching the show and hearing Mattia, the same way I was saying about the drivers that have that doubt. He articulated, we've questioned ourselves. Like he seemed like a person that was in a crisis of confidence. That stuff matriculates down your organization. When you have the head of the organization does not seem confident and forward and believe in what he or she is telling the group, that doesn't help. And that doesn't help the people below them push up and manage up. It doesn't help the people below them push down and manage down. So I believe their car was, for at least in the beginning of the year, it was the best car with bad strategy, especially as Red Bull was going through their reliability issues early on. I think that they will have a very good car. I think they have good drivers. I do think their lack of a team order is interesting. I mean, we all think it's Charles, but Carlos doesn't think that. I don't know if he co-signs that. So that there are times, and we saw last year, where he was undermining things on track to make sure he got his first win, which I understand, but at times can be detrimental to the team. So I have, I guess, a lot of belief in the fact that new leadership may put them on a course to actually compete with Red Bull and maybe end up in the split we're talking about.
I'm really excited to see what Alpine is going to do this weekend too, because they were hiding quite a bit, it seemed, in testing. And I mean, I think to that point, like, Oscar Piastri, right? There's a lot of hype around him, but also there are 3 rookies on the grid who have a lot to prove. I really want to see them in qualifying, like in particular, like let me see how fast they drive, and then strategies and things will unfold the next day. But I want to see how they acquit themselves, all 3 of those rookies, but particularly if Piastri is this generational talent that Alpine and Red Bull, as Christian Horner alluded to in Drive to Survive, believe he is.
I was so excited to see Piastri's first race, and not that I'm not going to be like tuning into that portion of it, but I'm not as excited anymore because of what Zach Brown had to say about the fact that their car is not where they expected it to be. Now, if Piastri comes out and places and gets points, maybe we're thinking differently of him and obviously his future in this sport, because he did it with a car that they're not excited about, or a car that wasn't what they anticipated having at the start of the season. So that could say more about him as a driver, especially as a rookie driver. But I was so excited after he sent that infamous tweet of like, what is his first race going to be like? What is his first weekend going to be like for Oscar Piastri? And then I feel like Brown just like completely deflated all of my hopes based on his comments about the car.
On the car, though, he was just like, it's just like Nick DeVries last year. I mean, he got his seat essentially from riding an inferior car into an impressive drive.
So true.
And bear in mind, those head-to-head odds right now are between DeVries and Tsunoda. It's DeVries minus 165 to score more points than his teammate Tsunoda as a rookie. I feel that number is, and his, like, I think Yuki's like plus 120. So you make more money. It's $1.20 on your money. So that dynamic, I think, is carried over into the betting market, that people believe that DeVries is this guy purely from that one drive they saw last year in an inferior car, to your point.
But the fact that you are now comparing a McLaren to a Williams is people at McLaren are like,
It's a good
no,
point,
it's not the car.
It's a good
it's
point.
inferior.
Yeah.
It's perceived or real inferior
okay.
material driven very well. You're saying the McLaren, if it is inferior and he drives well, you'll think more of Piastri. I think we all have, and the market has shown, they think more of De Vries based on that drive last year, way more than Tsunoda. That's a massive gap between two drivers. One is a rookie, one's been in the car before and hasn't been great, but hasn't been bad. To be that much of an underdog to his teammate is surprising, but that's going by people buying that one ride.
I'll leave you with this. Max Verstappen is no longer an option. Who other than that man will win the Bahrain Grand Prix?
Other than that man. Well, based on everything I just said, Leclerc, let's double down.
Yeah,
there you go.
That's what I was going to go with too, Charles.
Simpatico, same answer?
I think Ferrari's going to take it early, even though they've had changes. I don't think the Mercedes is there yet. I'm not fully believing that the Aston Martin can steal something. Obviously, there can be a wreck. It would be kind of cool to see Alonso do it. But yeah, I think the odds-on favorite should be Charles.
That's what I was going to say. Katie, who I think is going to win is very different than who I'm going to bet on. Because I think Alonso, you might get an interesting price or you might get a devalued price because everybody's on the train. I'm very interested to see what the numbers are on that former two-time world champion because he carries a lot of weight and that storyline carries a lot of hype. But I wonder what that means for the market.
Well, I would like to see some tweets from you this weekend as you start diving into that, okay? Give us your wisdom.
You know what you're going to see? You're going to see like, Louisville plus 15 against so-and-so, and then a pick right below that, just going to be the Bahrain Grand Prix. We're going to just mix basketball and
that hurt. Thank you. That hurt.
Well, I'm sorry.
I can't tell you both how much I appreciate you hopping on the show. Liz, Dalen, it was great to be with you guys. It's great to learn more about your all's journey into F1. I know that this is going to be a great season. We will be having you on more and more as we get going. Remember, if you're watching on YouTube, like this video, leave us a comment. Don't forget to subscribe to ESPN for more F1 content. And if you're listening to us somewhere, hit us with a 5-star review. Both of you have a great day. Enjoy the race this weekend. Cheers.